we used any sedative drugs or anything like that. And we have cooperated fully with the police. We'll answer any queries, any test that they want to do at any point.
There's absolutely no evidence that Madeleine is dead.
But then you hear
let me finish, please. There's absolutely no evidence that Madeleine is dead, and there's absolutely no evidence that we were involved in her disappearance. Well, that is the conclusion. Let me finish. That is the conclusion of the process, and that's what we're here debating. The conclusions of the process versus the conclusions of the book.
So they are not the same. The conviction of the inspectors.
Why would we be shocked? We're not denying the existence. Why would we be shocked? We're not denying the existence of the dogs or anything else. It's evidence we're interested in. There is no evidence that Madeleine is dead.
They're actually the pyjamas that Madeleine was wearing when she was taken.
There is no evidence that Madeleine is dead.
This sentence, spoken by Jerry McCann, is not just a denial. It is a wall, a shield, a declaration not only to the world, but perhaps also to himself and his wife, Kate. From the very beginning, the McCanns have stood unwavering in their belief Madeleine, their daughter, is not dead. That belief, calm on the surface, defiant underneath, became the emotional foundation of one of the most publicized missing persons cases in modern history. On the night of May 3, 2007, the McCanns' lives splintered. But from the moment Kate ran from apartment 5A, screaming, "They've taken her," the story that emerged was never just about a disappearance. It became about certainty versus doubt, evidence versus narrative, and most of all, grief versus public judgment. Speaking to the media not long after Madeleine vanished, Jerry repeated their stance with striking clarity.
We have cooperated fully with the police. We'll answer any queries.
There's absolutely no evidence that we were involved in her disappearance. Their tone wasn't passive. It wasn't pleading. It was defensive, organized, and media-ready. They weren't simply grieving parents, they were the architects of a message they knew had to be clear and consistent if they were going to survive both the trauma and the scrutiny. One recurring rumor, particularly in tabloid media, was that Madeleine had been sedated. The McCanns addressed this head-on.
We used any sedative drugs or anything like that.
Jerry stated plainly. The statement was meant to close the door on speculation that the child may have died of an accidental overdose. But instead, it opened another, if not sedation, then what? And why the emphasis? This instinct to correct, to control the narrative, became a defining feature of their public image. To some, it was admirable. To others, calculated. But at the core, it was survival. The McCanns understood early that the absence of hard evidence, no body, no witness, no definitive timeline, meant the story would be shaped not just by facts, but by emotion, optics, and public imagination. And in that vacuum, they had to speak louder than the doubt. So who was Madeleine McCann? She was 3 years old, nearly 4, at the time of her disappearance.
Madeleine is a beautiful, bright, funny and caring little girl. She is so special. Please, please do not hurt her. Please don't scare her. Please tell us where to find her. Or put her in a place of safety and let somebody know where she is.
It is these words, more than any forensic clue or official report, that humanized the case in its early days. The image of a mother begging for her child's safety traveled the world, from news broadcasts to candlelight vigils to missing persons posters on cafe walls in cities far from Portugal. But that visibility came at a price. The more the McCanns spoke, the more the public listened and judged. In the hours and days that followed Madeleine's disappearance, something began to form. Not just an investigation, but a collective narrative, a kind of folk crime story fueled by rumor, memory, press conferences, and the relentless hunger of a 24-hour news cycle. This wasn't just about a child who had gone missing. It became about the parents, their decision to leave the children asleep while dining nearby, their body language in interviews, their choice of words, their refusal to cry on camera. Everything became evidence not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. As the search dragged on and theories mounted, the McCanns' insistence on Madeleine being alive became both their strength and their vulnerability. To some, it was hope. To others, denial. But as Kate wrote in her later memoir, desperation does strange things to people. "We are both scientists," she said. "We don't believe in hocus pocus. But when no one else is finding your child, you try everything." Indeed, the story of Madeleine McCann would eventually come to include psychic maps, DNA location devices, and tabloid-funded detectives, all in the absence of the one thing that mattered: answers. And yet, through it all, the McCanns clung to a single line: "There is no evidence she is dead." That sentence, in its repetition, grew into a psychological anchor, one that perhaps helped them cope with what might otherwise destroy them. But it also exposed them to accusations. Critics saw their media engagement as manipulation. Others questioned their composure. But grief does not follow a script, nor does guilt. And in the McCann case, emotion and suspicion became interchangeable currencies. Was their refusal to break down on camera a sign of strength or something else? None of this, of course, brings us closer to knowing what happened. But it tells us how a story is built and how it survives. From the first day, the McCanns worked to build a narrative around innocence, cooperation, and above all, the belief that their daughter could still come home. They asked the world to see Madeleine not as a symbol, not as a victim, but as a living child. A child with a room, and a favorite toy, and a family still waiting. But beneath their carefully structured message lies a deeper truth. This case was never just about one child. It became about what we do in the absence of truth. How we fill in the gaps. How we decide who to believe. How we cope with the idea that a child can simply vanish. And so, the McCanns' early declarations were more than just defensive. They were preemptive shields in a war they didn't ask to fight. A war not just for their daughter, but for the right to grieve without being prosecuted by opinion, for the right to hold on to hope in a world that kept trying to take it away. There is no evidence that Madeleine is dead. It may not be conclusive. But for the McCanns, it remains the closest thing they have to truth.
Kill your daughter?
Did you kill your daughter? The question was direct, cold, and devastating. Jerry McCann did not hesitate.
No.
That's an emphatic no. He called the idea ludicrous. What he asked had been suggested, that Madeleine died by accident in the apartment, that they, the parents, had hidden her body. Well,
When did she have the accident and died? Because the only time she was left unattended was when we were at dinner. So if she died then, how could we have disposed or hidden her body, when there was an immediate threat? It's just nonsense. So, and if she died when we were in the apartment or fell and did, why would we?
it was a strong denial, logical. But to some investigators, the logic wasn't the only thing that mattered. It was the need for logic, the defensiveness, the readiness for that question perhaps before it was even asked. Beyond the headlines and the public appeals, there was the evidence, real, raw, and hidden beneath the surface. It was the kind of material that rarely made it into the polished press conferences or nightly news reports. But it existed in the official Portuguese police files, in video footage, and in inconsistencies buried within the timeline. At the heart of this section is a fact rarely explored with enough weight: the original timeline and statements made by the group were not entirely consistent. One of the first documented shifts involved a witness statement from one of the McCann's friends, which was later revised by Jerry McCann himself. The change was subtle, but to experienced investigators, it raised a flag. When timelines begin to shift, especially in the critical early days of a disappearance, it is often a sign that not everyone is on the same page. Or, at the very least, that someone is shaping a narrative. And then there were the dogs. 2 British sniffer dogs, Eddie and Keela, were flown into Portugal along with their handler, Martin Grime. Eddie was a cadaver dog, trained specifically to detect the scent of human decomposition. Keela, on the other hand, was a blood detection dog, capable of identifying traces of human blood at a molecular level. These were not ordinary animals. Their work had been used in countless major investigations around the world. Their arrival in Praia da Luz marked a significant turning point in the McCann case. When brought into apartment 5EA, where Madeleine had last been seen, Eddie alerted multiple times. He barked near the wardrobe in the parents' bedroom, behind the sofa in the living area, and at the soft toy, Cuddle Cat. Madeleine's comfort toy, often seen in photos with her. These alerts suggested the presence of a cadaver sent the odor released from a human body after death. Keela followed. She also responded in several of the same locations, indicating the presence of blood. The blood was invisible to the naked eye, but the dog's reaction was clear. To seasoned investigators, this kind of dual alert from two different dogs, trained for two different purposes, was significant. And for the Portuguese police, it was potentially explosive. But that wasn't all. Weeks after Madeleine disappeared, the McCanns had rented a car, a silver Renault Scenic. There was nothing unusual about this decision at the time. But when the dogs were sent to inspect the vehicle, both of them reacted again. Eddie alerted to the trunk of the car, and Keela signaled the presence of blood near the boot lining and car key. The car had been rented 23 days after the disappearance. The question quickly became, why would there be cadaver scent or blood in a car rented 3 weeks after Madeleine vanished? The police were concerned. The media, once sympathetic, began to shift. What had started as the story of a helpless family became a case of growing suspicion. Yet as quickly as that suspicion flared, it was pushed into uncertainty. Because when forensic tests were run on the samples collected from both the apartment and the car, no conclusive DNA was found. Early results showed possible matches, some consistent with Madeleine's profile, but nothing definitive. The samples were too degraded, too partial, or mixed with other genetic material. In many other cases, this would have been the point where the investigation changed direction entirely. But in this case, it didn't. The lack of direct, indisputable forensic evidence meant no charges could be brought. The dog's alerts were treated as supporting information, not standalone proof. And yet, the footage was undeniable. In videos now publicly available, Eddie is seen barking sharply, focused repeatedly at the same locations inside the McCann's apartment. Keela's behavior is more subtle, a shift in posture, a nose pressed against the tile, a sign she has found something below the surface. Together, they painted a picture that was uncomfortable, even for the most objective observers. To some, these reactions were damning. To others, they were circumstantial at best. But the core question remained, what do you do with indirect evidence when direct evidence doesn't exist? The complexity deepened with telecommunications data. Investigators obtained phone records from the night of May 3, including call logs and text messages between members of the Tapas group. There were inconsistencies not necessarily in content, but in timing and pattern. Some calls were made that raised questions, particularly because certain people were contacted and others were not, during a period where every second mattered. There were even calls that went unanswered, with no follow-up, no explanation. Portuguese investigators noted these anomalies, but the data was never fully analyzed. In a later internal report by the UK Home Office, it was revealed that a vast amount of cell site data had been gathered, but there was no clear evidence that it was ever properly reviewed. In the era of smartphones and GPS, this omission is significant. Had this data been cross-referenced with witness statements, dog alerts, and movement timelines, investigators might have been able to place individuals near specific locations or disprove certain claims. Instead, much of the data was left dormant, buried in files that would gather dust. Why was it never used? The answer might lie in another kind of evidence: structural failure. The investigation into Madeleine McCann was, from early on, plagued by fragmentation between the Portuguese and British authorities. The two police systems operated under different protocols, with different standards for evidence handling, interrogation, and judicial processes. Communication was often strained, and decisions about what to share or not share were inconsistent. At times, British police were accused of acting with arrogance. At others, Portuguese officers were accused of lacking modern investigative tools. And somewhere between those accusations, evidence was mishandled, leads went cold, and doubt festered. The blood traces, the canine alerts, the cell phone records, and even the inconsistencies in testimony, none of them led to an arrest. But none of them were refuted either. They exist in the case files as shadows pointing in a direction, but never reaching a destination. For those who study this case, the lack of resolution is not only frustrating, it's instructive. It shows what happens when evidence is fragmented, when agencies work in silos, and when indirect signs are treated as speculative rather than cumulative. And yet, the most haunting aspect of this chapter is not just what was found, it's what might have been missed. In the days following Madeleine McCann's disappearance, the investigation zeroed in not just on the parents, but on the people they dined with that night. 7 adults, all close friends or colleagues of Kate and Jerry McCann, had traveled together to Praia da Luz. They were doctors, professionals' parents. Their children, like the McCanns, were young, most under the age of 5. They stayed in the same apartment complex, and every evening, they gathered for dinner at the Tapas restaurant about 100 meters away. They became known as the Tapas 7. Their statements were among the first to be taken, and from the beginning, they were reassuringly consistent in the broad strokes but uneven in the details. David Payne was the last known adult, aside from Kate and Jerry McCann, to see Madeleine alive. Sometime between 6:30 and 7 p.m. David reportedly stopped by apartment 5A to check on the McCann children while Kate was getting ready. He later stated that he saw Madeleine, alive and well, wearing white pajamas with a pink floral design. His account has often been considered a kind of timestamp, a final visual confirmation of the child before nightfall. But the exact duration of his visit was unclear, and he claimed not to have entered the bedroom fully. He said he exchanged a few words with Kate at the doorway and had only a brief glimpse of the children. Whether that glimpse was enough to confirm Madeleine's well-being would later be debated. Payne's statement would serve as an anchor point. But it was not the only timeline in question. At 9:15 p.m., Jane Tanner, another member of the Tapas 7, claimed to have witnessed something critical. As she walked back from her apartment after checking on her own children, she saw a man carrying a small child in pajamas, crossing the road near apartment 5A. According to Tanner, the man was walking swiftly, heading away from the McCann's flat, with the child's legs dangling and her arms motionless. She described his clothing, the child's light-colored sleepwear, and even the way the child's head rested on his shoulder. But what made this sighting so controversial was its proximity to Jerry McCann and another man, Jeremy Wilkins, who were standing nearby, chatting at that very moment. Neither of them saw anyone. Neither recalled seeing Jane Tanner either. Jeremy Wilkins, a TV producer who was staying in the same resort, had also been checking on his child that night. He spoke with Jerry for several minutes just outside apartment 5A. When later asked if he saw a man carrying a child or even Jane Tanner, he said no. This contradiction was critical. Tanner's account had the potential to be the key sighting in the entire case, a glimpse of the possible abductor. But the fact that 2 other adults standing nearby saw nothing at all cast doubt over her statement. Investigators puzzled over the positioning. Could the angle of the streetlights explain why she saw something others missed? Was her mind influenced by the chaos that followed, prompting her to misremember? Or was it simply a case of attentional blindness, of seeing what others overlook? Either way, her statement became a pillar of the early abduction narrative. And yet, it stood alone. Roughly 15 minutes after Tanner's sighting, at 9:30 p.m., Matthew Oldfield went to check on the McCann children. He did so as a favor. His apartment was next to theirs, and the group had been rotating child checks throughout the evening. Oldfield later stated that he entered through the unlocked patio doors, walked into the bedroom hallway, and noticed the door to the children's room was open wider than before. He heard nothing unusual. He didn't turn on the light, and, crucially, he didn't step far enough into the room to see the individual beds. From the angle he stood, he could see the twins, but not Madeleine's bed directly. And yet, he assumed all was well. That assumption, small as it seemed, would prove pivotal. Because when Kate McCann went to check the children at 10 p.m., Madeleine was gone. If Oldfield had looked directly into the room, had seen that Madeleine was already missing, it would have drastically altered the timeline of events. But because he didn't, the window of potential disappearance remained open between 9 and 10 p.m. Oldfield's statement was not questioned maliciously, but investigators wondered, was his decision not to check fully just an oversight, or was there an unconscious desire not to disturb the narrative that everything was fine? Beyond the specifics of each statement, investigators became increasingly interested in the psychology of the group. All 7 adults had known each other for years. Some were university friends. Some were colleagues. Most were doctors. They were close-knit, protective of one another, and uniformly supportive of the McCanns. No one in the group ever publicly contradicted the McCanns' version of events. While this loyalty is understandable, it also raised questions. When minor discrepancies emerged, such as differences in the reported times of child checks, or the routes taken between the restaurant and the apartments, the group seemed to close ranks rather than clarify. Was this an effort to protect each other, or simply the natural confusion that follows a traumatic event? The Portuguese police eventually began to suspect the possibility of what psychologists call group conformity, not deliberate collusion, but subtle alignment of memory and narrative under social pressure. When one person remembers a detail differently, they may self-correct if the group disagrees. It's not necessarily lying, it's memory under stress, especially in the context of fear, guilt, or trauma. And yet, in a criminal investigation, those subtle shifts can change everything. The Tapas 7 statements were each taken multiple times. Most were consistent on general points, who was where and when. But on finer details, like who saw which door open, who heard noises, or what time checks were done, the accounts diverged. In some cases, notes in police files show small but important rewordings between interviews. One check that had taken place at 9:20 became 9:30. One route used to return to the apartment changed direction. These weren't dramatic errors, but in a case built on minutes and movement, they mattered. In one police report, investigators wrote that the overall pattern of the statements appeared rehearsed not in an overt way, but in the sense that the story's structure remained unchanged despite new questioning. This rigidity, they noted, could suggest either truthful consistency or deliberate narrative control. The public, when later shown diagrams of the complex, highlighting who walked where and when, was left confused. Diagrams contradicted one another, lines crossed, timing overlapped, and in that confusion, reasonable doubt flourished. One of the more troubling implications of the Tapas 7 statements was that none of them could say definitively who last saw Madeleine alive, aside from David Payne's brief visit before dinner. Between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m., the child was assumed safe until she wasn't. That assumption hung over everything. The Tapas 7 were not accused of wrongdoing, but their presence and their coordinated statements became a permanent fixture in the case. Their loyalty to the McCanns was admirable, but their timelines never quite clicked into place. Was it confusion, groupthink, or something more deliberate? What their role illustrates is how, in the absence of hard evidence, human memory becomes both the most valuable and most unreliable tool in any investigation. In the Madeleine McCann case, even the smallest discrepancies, a slightly altered timeline, a room not fully checked, a man unseen by 2 witnesses, could hold the difference between clarity and chaos. And for those still searching for answers, that difference remains unresolved. At 10 p.m. on the evening of May 3, 2007, Kate McCann left the Tapas restaurant. It was her turn to check on the children. She had already exchanged a few words with Jerry about the night, but nothing seemed unusual. Their routine was set. They had already been checking on the kids every 30 minutes, each taking their turn to walk back to the apartment and ensure everything was fine. The path from the restaurant to apartment 5A was only a short walk, no more than a minute or 2. The evening air was warm, and the resort was quiet. Nothing seemed out of place. The parents had followed their usual ritual, the children were asleep, and Kate was confident that all was well, just as it had been every other night of their holiday. But when Kate opened the door to the apartment, she immediately noticed something was wrong. The bedroom door was open wider than usual, more than it had been when she and Jerry had left just an hour earlier. It was an odd detail, one that stood out immediately. As she moved through the apartment, her eyes were drawn to the window. It was wide open, the shutter raised, and the curtains fluttering in the breeze. The room, which had been closed off, was now exposed to the outside. She stood there for a moment, absorbing the scene, but something still felt off. Her gaze then dropped to Madeleine's bed, It was empty. The realization hit her like a wave. The bed was empty, but the twins, Sean and Amelie, were still sleeping soundly in their cots, undisturbed. It was at that moment that the full weight of the situation began to settle in. In a single breath, Kate's sense of calm fractured into pure panic. The emptiness of Madeleine's bed, paired with the wide open window, struck her as an immediate sign of danger. She couldn't process everything at once. Her mind raced, but her body acted on instinct. "They've taken her." The words came out of her mouth, sharp and raw, with no filter. "They've taken her. She's gone." The cry echoed through the apartment, and in that moment, it felt like everything else ceased to exist. There was no time to check for fingerprints or examine the room. There was no time to calm herself and assess the situation. Kate's words were both a scream of desperation and a statement of fact. But even in that chaotic moment, a crucial question lingered. Why didn't Kate stay with the twins? Why didn't she try to protect the children still sleeping in their cots, instead of running out of the apartment in search of help? Kate's reaction to rush back to the Tapas bar, leaving the twins behind, was not one of neglect, but rather an instinct driven by panic and fear. When a child is missing, every second feels like an eternity. A parent doesn't stop to think. They run, they search, they call out for help. In that instant, Kate's brain was flooded with adrenaline, and the only thing that mattered was finding Madeleine. The thought of the twins, while important, was secondary in her mind. They were still in the apartment. They were still safe. But Madeleine was gone, and that was the immediate crisis. But in hindsight, this decision to leave the twins behind, a decision made in the heat of the moment, would later be scrutinized. Why not call for help from the balcony? Why not shout for assistance from the apartment? In those moments, Kate's sole focus was Madeleine's absence, and her instinctive action was to run to the only place she knew to find help, back to the restaurant. The question of leaving the twins is not easy to answer. Grief and panic are often irrational, particularly in situations involving extreme distress. A parent's first reaction to losing one child is to focus on that child, on what might have happened to them. For Kate, the twins' safety was never in immediate jeopardy. She knew they were still in their cots, likely safe, but Madeleine was not. When Kate reached the restaurant, her shouting immediately attracted attention. "They've taken her. She's gone," echoed through the Tapas area. Jerry, who had been sitting at the table, was the first to react. His immediate response was disbelief, but that disbelief quickly turned into action. He, along with the rest of the Tapas group, rushed back to the apartment. What followed was a chaotic search of the apartment and the surrounding areas. The group ran through the resort, checking alleys, knocking on doors, and calling out for Madeleine. Some of the resort staff joined in the search, but without any real plan. There was no clear direction. There was no investigative protocol. No perimeter was secured. The apartment was not sealed off as a potential crime scene. Instead, it was left open, and others entered it without proper supervision. The whole search was motivated by panic, not protocol. What was missing in this frantic rush was the essential element for any proper investigation: a controlled environment. The apartment should have been secured. Evidence should have been documented. No one should have been allowed to disturb the scene. But in the early stages of the search, there was no time for that. This moment of panic, Kate's scream, Jerry's frantic response, marked the beginning of the shift. The McCanns went from being parents looking for a missing child to being subjects of a criminal investigation. The police were called immediately, and within hours, the first officers arrived. The initial assumption was that Madeleine had been abducted, but as the hours passed and the scene became more chaotic, the assumption began to shift. Questions started to be asked. Had the parents been responsible? Could something have happened to Madeleine inside the apartment? For the McCanns, the trauma of Madeleine's disappearance was quickly compounded by the dawning realization that they were now under suspicion. And yet, at this stage, there was no definitive evidence. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, just a missing child, a panicked family, and a growing sense of confusion. The story shifted from one of innocent loss to one of suspicion. It was no longer just a case of a child missing. It was now a potential criminal investigation. That moment, Kate's scream, Jerry's disbelief, the chaotic search became the turning point in the case. The emotional devastation of parents searching for their child was overshadowed by the harsh reality. The search was no longer just about Madeleine. It had become a legal and investigative battleground. The critical moment of 10 p.m. marked not just the discovery of Madeleine's disappearance, but also the beginning of the transformational shift in the case from parents desperately searching for a child to a criminal investigation. Kate's instinctive reaction to leave the twins behind and rush for help is understandable in the moment of crisis. However, it was also this very moment, this rush without protocol, that would set the stage for all the subsequent questions and doubts about the investigation. What started as a frantic search for a child would soon evolve into a scrutiny of every action, every word, and every decision made that night. The McCanns were no longer just parents of a missing child. They were now key figures in a criminal case, with every move and word under intense investigation. The moment Kate discovered Madeleine was gone was more than just the beginning of a personal nightmare. It was the beginning of a public trial. Madeleine McCann's disappearance was not just a tragedy. It became a global spectacle, one that reverberated across continents and captured the collective imagination of the world. Within hours of the disappearance, her face, framed by big brown eyes and blonde hair, was plastered across news outlets, websites, and posters. She became the most famous missing child in modern history, her image etched into the memories of millions. Her story, like so many before it, would evoke empathy and sorrow. But it would also provoke a deeper, darker emotion: doubt. As the years stretched on, the investigation into Madeleine's disappearance became one of the most expensive and high-profile missing persons cases ever. More than £10 million was spent, primarily by the British government, as Scotland Yard and other international agencies poured resources into the search for the little girl. Despite the massive expenditure, there was no breakthrough, no significant clue, no major lead that would have brought the case to closure. Instead of resolution, the case spiraled into increasing complexity, with each new theory pushing the investigation in different directions. Was Madeleine abducted? Was she murdered by accident? Was she the victim of an invasion? Or was this a case of human trafficking? The theories were endless. And as they evolved, so too did the media frenzy. The media landscape surrounding the case was polarized. On one hand, there were those who viewed the McCanns as the tragic parents of a missing child, doing everything they could to find her. They were seen as innocent victims, deserving of support and empathy. On the other hand, there were those who saw them as suspects, questioning their actions, their decisions, and their responses in the days after Madeleine's disappearance. The media outlets often blurred the lines between journalism and sensationalism. Tabloid papers in the UK ran headlines questioning the McCanns' role in their daughter's disappearance, often placing them under suspicion without any concrete evidence. The press pored over their every movement, looking for inconsistencies in their accounts, and dissected their public appearances for signs of guilt. The McCanns were attacked from all sides. The public scrutiny became almost unbearable, as every aspect of their lives was put under the microscope. From the way they spoke in interviews to the way they dressed in public, everything was analyzed. They were criticized for leaving their children unattended at the apartment, even though it was common practice among families vacationing in similar resorts. In addition to traditional media, social media quickly became a battleground. Kate and Jerry McCann were viciously attacked online by individuals and groups who claimed they were responsible for Madeleine's disappearance. The anonymity of the internet only fueled this cruel and unrelenting campaign. They were labeled as bad parents, even criminals. Death threats were posted on social media, and many people publicly accused them of staging the disappearance for financial gain or to cover up an accidental death. The vitriol was overwhelming, and the McCanns, already reeling from the loss of their daughter, found themselves battling a new, invisible enemy: public hatred. The McCanns' mental health and emotional well-being were pushed to the brink as the relentless pressure from the media and public continued. They were forced to shut down certain parts of their lives, including their social media presence, in a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of normalcy and privacy. In Portugal, the response was no less hostile. Some members of the Portuguese public criticized the McCanns for leaving their children alone in the apartment that night, pointing out that it was a cultural norm in many countries, including Portugal, to keep children within sight at all times. These criticisms were amplified by the Portuguese police, who were criticized for mismanaging the investigation and allowing media speculation to overshadow the facts. In a country that values family bonds deeply, the idea of leaving children unattended while dining at a restaurant became anathema. For many in Portugal, the McCanns' actions appeared reckless and irresponsible, and this sentiment seeped into the public consciousness. In the years that followed, Madeleine's case became an emblem of the cultural divide between the British and the Portuguese. The British, keen to hold the McCanns blameless, and the Portuguese, quick to judge them as negligent. This divide was never fully bridged, further adding to the growing tension between the two countries. And yet, despite the media firestorm and the millions of dollars invested in the investigation, the case remained unsolved. No one was arrested, no one was convicted. There was no concrete evidence to definitively point to the whereabouts of Madeleine McCann, and no body was ever found. The police were unable to recover any physical evidence from the apartment that could explain her disappearance. No witness came forward with a solid lead. Despite the extensive search efforts across multiple countries, Madeleine's body remained elusive. There was also no confession. No person, whether a potential abductor, a trafficker, or a killer, ever came forward to admit guilt. The only thing that remained were questions. And with those questions, speculation continued. The absence of a body left lingering doubts. Theories about Madeleine's fate swirled endlessly. Some believed she had been abducted and trafficked. Others suspected that she had died in the apartment, either accidentally or violently. Some theorists even suggested that the McCanns themselves might have had a role in their daughter's death, even though no one was ever able to prove this. The case was a paradox. The more time that passed, the more the mystery deepened. The more theories emerged, the less clear the truth became. The world had watched as Madeleine McCann's face became a symbol of both hope and loss, and as the years dragged on, it seemed less likely that the truth would ever be found. As the years stretched into a decade, the McCanns continued their search. Their determination never wavered. Every year, they marked another birthday for Madeleine, and they remained resolute in their belief that one day, the truth would come out. Even though the case remained cold, they never gave up hope that their daughter might be found. But the emotional toll was immense. The constant pressure from the media, the ongoing public scrutiny, and the failure to secure justice for their daughter had taken a heavy toll on their marriage, their mental health, and their lives. Yet, despite the emotional and psychological challenges, the McCanns' determination to seek the truth for Madeleine remained their driving force. They continued to call for new investigations, new leads, and new evidence. What remains from the Madeleine McCann case is not just a tragedy, but a legacy of public doubt, polarized opinions, and unanswered questions. The public perception of the McCanns has shifted over the years from sympathetic parents to suspects and back again. How do we view them now? As parents caught in a nightmare of unspeakable loss, or as people whose grief became the fodder of a media circus? The legacy of the case is one of fragmented narratives. The McCanns' fight for their daughter became a fight for their own innocence. In the absence of a definitive answer, the debate continues, with no resolution in sight. And so, the story of Madeleine McCann, the little girl who vanished into thin air, remains a haunting echo of what might have been and what never was. We are left with the image of a family that lost everything and a public that cannot forget. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann has left a trail of unsolved mysteries, and even to this day, many questions remain unanswered. One of the first oddities was why the window to the bedroom was found open, yet there was no sign of forced entry. Investigators considered the possibility of abduction, but if a stranger had broken into the apartment, why was there no clear evidence of a break-in? No signs of force, no shattered glass, no marks on the window. Could it be that someone had entered the room without being noticed before Kate discovered Madeleine was missing? This leads to another possibility, that someone within the group of Tapas 7 might have entered the room without revealing it. The group was close-knit friends who had been vacationing together for years. Was it possible that one of them had entered the room to check on the children, or for some other reason, and didn't mention it? Why, if this were the case, did no one come forward to clarify this? The silence surrounding this possibility raised many questions about the group's behavior during that critical time. Was there a deliberate attempt to conceal certain actions, or were the memories simply blurred by the trauma of the event? Further complicating the situation was the crucial statement made by Jane Tanner. She claimed that at around 9:15 p.m., while walking past the apartment, she saw a man carrying a child in pajamas heading away from the apartment. According to Tanner, the child's body was limp, and the pajamas appeared to match what Madeleine was wearing. Yet, Jerry McCann and Jeremy Wilkins, who were standing nearby at that exact time, saw nothing. How could Jane have been the only one to witness this event, with no one else confirming her account? Could Jane have been mistaken in her identification, or was there a possibility that she created a misleading lead intentionally? Her statement, once critical to the case, remained a puzzle that investigators could not conclusively resolve. Then there was the issue of forensic evidence. The cadaver dogs, Eddie and Keela, both reacted strongly to scents inside the McCann's apartment and in the car they had rented weeks after Madeleine disappeared. Eddie, trained to detect human remains, and Keela, trained to detect blood, both alerted to locations that seemed significant, yet no conclusive DNA results emerged from the analysis of the samples. The samples were either degraded or mixed with other genetic material, making it difficult to confirm whether they could directly be linked to Madeleine. Was this a case of forensic evidence being intentionally overlooked, or was the analysis simply incomplete? Equally baffling were the unverified phone calls made on the night of May 3. Records showed several calls had been made during the crucial period between 8:30 p.m. and 10 p.m., but the identity of the caller and the recipient remained unclear. These calls were not followed up on, and no one ever explained why. What was the significance of these calls, and why were they not fully investigated? If these were important leads, why weren't they pursued more aggressively? The lack of clarity around these calls added yet another layer of confusion to an already muddled case. And then there's the question, if this was an abduction, why was there no ransom demand? In most child abduction cases, especially those involving young children, a ransom is usually demanded. But in Madeleine's case, there was no such demand. Was the abduction part of a larger, more organized criminal network, such as child trafficking? Or was it something more personal, a crime of opportunity, where the abductor had no intention of making money, but instead had some other motive? The absence of a ransom demand raised critical questions about the true nature of the abduction, or whether it was even an abduction at all. Perhaps the most perplexing question of all is whether someone had a vested interest in ensuring the case was never solved. Could there have been forces at work, either within the community, law enforcement, or even beyond, that wanted the investigation to remain unsolved? If the authorities were getting too close to discovering the truth, could someone have intentionally misled investigators, obscured key pieces of evidence, or simply allowed the case to fade into obscurity? The idea that the investigation was being manipulated intentionally or by omission remains one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. These unanswered questions, the open window, the conflicting witness statements, the unexplained phone calls, the forensic evidence that went nowhere, have left the world with more doubts than answers. Madeleine McCann's case has become a study in ambiguity. Every new theory, every fresh piece of evidence has been surrounded by uncertainty, forcing the public to fill in the gaps with speculation. What was once a straightforward case of a missing child has transformed into a dissection of human memory, human behavior, and human error. And while the case remains unsolved, it's the lingering doubts that continue to haunt. Each unanswered question forms a new layer of complexity that no one has been able to resolve. Could someone have tampered with the evidence? Could Jane Tanner's account have been manipulated for a reason? Did the police mishandle critical leads? And if there are answers out there, why have they not been uncovered in over a decade of searching? The questions, it seems, will continue to fester like an open wound that never heals. Madeleine's fate remains as elusive as ever, and with each passing year, the possibility of finding a definitive answer grows more distant. But perhaps the greatest mystery of all is not just what happened to Madeleine McCann, but why the case has remained unresolved for so long. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann became not only a criminal investigation, but also a media spectacle, a battle between belief and conspiracy that played out across newspapers, television, and, increasingly, social media. From the first day of her disappearance, the case was swept into the whirlwind of public scrutiny. Her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, were suddenly at the center of a media storm, and as the days turned into weeks, months, and then years, the world watched as their every move was dissected. But what followed was far more than a story about a missing child. It became a contest of narratives, the official story of hope, and the growing alternative theories that sought to explain what happened to Madeleine. The British press played a pivotal role in shaping public perception, particularly in the early days. The media quickly framed Kate and Jerry McCann as tragic victims' parents who had lost their daughter in the most horrifying way imaginable. This portrayal helped garner worldwide sympathy for the McCanns, making their names synonymous with grief and helplessness. The public rallied around the family, and the press followed suit, portraying them as the perfect parents, whose lives had been shattered by the crime. However, the same media that initially supported the McCanns also became the first to cast suspicion on them. The tabloids, in particular, were quick to shift the focus from the search for Madeleine to the McCanns' own behavior. Questions were raised about whether they were truly innocent, with headlines suggesting that Kate and Jerry McCann might have been involved in their daughter's disappearance. The press insinuated that Madeleine's parents might have been hiding something. Was their grief genuine, or was it part of an act? The media coverage was not just sympathetic, it was conflicting. The McCanns' every public appearance was analyzed for inconsistencies in their statements, for their emotional displays, or for signs of deception. Were they grieving too much? Too little? Was their composure a sign of strength or guilt? The British tabloids took advantage of every opportunity to sell a story, weaving an intricate web of speculation, doubt, and shifting narratives. Over time, the McCanns became both victims and suspects, depending on which media outlet you turn to. In the eyes of the public, they were either innocent parents caught in a nightmare or the masterminds of a cover-up. And this duality, one minute compassionate, the next culpable, kept the McCanns in the media spotlight, but not for the reasons they would have wanted. As the case unfolded, social media began to play an even greater role. Platform social became the home of every possible theory, some rational, many absurd. Madeleine McCann was no longer just the subject of news articles, she became a central figure in the world of online speculation. Social media gave rise to a multitude of conspiracy theories, many of which circulated widely without any basis in fact. One of the most persistent and damaging rumors was that Madeleine had been abducted by a trafficking ring. This theory was circulated in various online forums, with unsubstantiated claims of people seeing Madeleine in other countries and suggestions that her abduction was part of a larger, organized criminal network. Images of children in other parts of the world were posted, suggesting they resembled Madeleine, fueling the idea that she had been sold into trafficking. Alongside the trafficking theories were the darker and more morbid rumors that Madeleine had been killed by her parents, that her body had been disposed of, or that she had died accidentally. The press and the public, unable to accept that Madeleine simply vanished, quickly turned to the most disturbing explanations. One particularly dark theory involved organ trafficking, with some suggesting that Madeleine had been kidnapped for her organs, based on vague and unverified accounts of similar crimes in other countries. These rumors were driven by fear, misinformation, and the media's ability to amplify every shadowy possibility. But despite the growing online outrage, there was no definitive evidence to back any of these claims. Yet, in the age of social media, a lack of evidence did not stop the spread of these ideas. Trolls and conspiracy theorists jumped at every opportunity to post their versions of the truth, while the McCanns had to contend not only with the official investigation, but also with the relentless pressure of an uninformed, often hostile online audience. These rumors weren't just damaging to the McCanns, they created a climate of fear and suspicion that overshadowed the search for Madeleine. The more the public became entrenched in these false narratives, the less likely they were to support the investigation into her disappearance. What made the case of Madeleine McCann even more complex was the polarization of public opinion. From the start, the McCanns were caught between two extremes, those who believed in their innocence and those who doubted them. This divide became a significant factor in the way the case was handled, both in the media and in the official investigation. While a significant portion of the public stood by the McCanns, believing they were the victims of an unimaginable crime, another faction began to question their every move. The more time passed without answers, the more the case seemed to devolve into a battle between supporters and detractors. Some argued that the McCanns were merely caught in a situation beyond their control, while others believed that they were hiding something darker. This polarization didn't just affect the McCanns' reputation, it also stalled the investigation. Instead of focusing on new leads or evidence, the case became increasingly divided. The lack of closure or resolution meant that people were free to fill in the gaps with their own theories, further complicating the search for Madeleine. The investigation also faced structural problems, with mistrust between the British and Portuguese police. The media didn't help by sowing division between the two countries, creating an environment where collaboration became difficult, and important evidence was overlooked or dismissed. One of the most profound aspects of this case is the psychological impact it had not just on the McCanns, but on society as a whole. The case became an emblem of loss, uncertainty, and the search for truth. The longer it went unresolved, the more the public began to focus on the mystery of Madeleine's disappearance, rather than the search for real answers. Why does this case continue to captivate the world's attention? What makes Madeleine McCann's disappearance so haunting? There is something deeply psychological about a case where no resolution exists, where the child remains forever missing, and where the evidence points in many directions but never leads to a conclusion. For millions of people, the question of what happened continues to gnaw at them. It is an open wound in the collective consciousness, and the lack of closure leaves a space for speculation, for guessing, and for the constant re-examination of facts. For some, Madeleine McCann represents the innocence lost, a child who was snatched from the world without a trace. For others, she symbolizes the failure of justice, a case that seems to mock the very notion that truth can be discovered, no matter how much effort is put into the search. The case remains unresolved, leaving society in a kind of limbo, where Madeleine's face still appears on posters, where her name is still mentioned in news stories, and where her story is still told, year after year. As the world continues to search for answers, Madeleine McCann's case is a symbol of both hope and despair, of what happens when society chooses suspicion over waiting for the truth. The story of Madeleine McCann is a haunting one. As the years pass, her name still lingers on the lips of the world, but the resolution that so many yearn for remains elusive. The McCann family continues to fight, to search, and to cling to hope. Every year, they mark Madeleine's birthday, a bittersweet reminder that their daughter, who would now be 22 years old, is still missing. Every candle blown out in her honor is a silent protest against the passing years and the lack of answers. In their public statements, the McCanns have made it clear, "One will never stop searching. We will leave no stone unturned." These words, spoken with the conviction of parents who have lived through every parent's worst nightmare, resonate as both a declaration and a plea. Despite the passage of time, despite the fact that many in the world have moved on to other stories, they remain unwavering in their commitment to finding Madeleine. They will not rest until they know what happened to their daughter. And yet, despite this determination, the case remains open, though unfinished. The Portuguese, British, and German police have all continued to investigate, but the file remains far from closed. With every new year, new leads emerge, but they rarely lead to answers. Christian Brokener, the man once formally named as the prime suspect, still looms large in the case. He remains under investigation, yet no charges have been filed against him as of today. The case, which has spanned over 18 years, continues to spiral in uncertainty. Brokener's name is forever linked with Madeleine's disappearance, but the legal system has not yet found the definitive link to charge him with anything. For all the speculation, the interviews, the revelations, and the dogged investigative work, there remains a critical absence of hard evidence that would allow the authorities to move forward. Without it, Brokener remains a suspect, but one without a criminal conviction, and the investigation stalls again and again. The question that remains, as it has for years, is what happened to Madeleine McCann? Was she abducted? Or did something more tragic happen inside that apartment? Were the McCanns somehow involved in her disappearance, as some have suggested? Or did a stranger commit a crime so well executed that it continues to evade the grasp of law enforcement? And, even more pointedly, has Madeleine McCann been forgotten? In a world where media cycles turn faster than ever, where new headlines eclipse old stories, it's easy to wonder how many people still care about the disappearance of this one little girl. The world was captivated when Madeleine went missing, but as the years piled up, the interest waned. The investigation continued, but fewer people followed it with the same fervor as they once did. The 24-hour news cycle replaced Madeleine's case with new scandals, new events, new tragedies. Yet, for the McCanns, the fight to find their daughter is still very real. They are the ones who continue to remember Madeleine with the same intensity and love as they did on that fateful night in 2007. And they will never let go of their belief that somewhere, somehow, Madeleine can still be found. The absence of resolution, no body, no confession, no closure has created a void that is felt by both the McCanns and the public. It is a silence that speaks volumes. There is no finality, no sense of justice, no neat ending. The case is still incomplete, like a book that has been started but left unfinished, its pages open but unread. The most unsettling part of the Madeleine McCann case is the lack of truth. The evidence is fragmented, the theories endless. There are whispers about Brokener, but no concrete evidence to tie him to the crime. There are theories about abduction, trafficking, and even accident, but nothing has been definitively proven. The world is left with questions, but no answers to bring peace. At the heart of it all, the world is left with the question: who remembers Madeleine McCann now? Does anyone still care as much as they once did? Or has the passage of time faded her memory for most people? Is she just another missing child, part of an endless cycle of cold cases, or is she something more? For the McCanns, the answer is clear: Madeleine is not forgotten. They continue to remember her every day. But as the years drag on, the world has begun to ask, perhaps more quietly, perhaps more hesitantly, is anyone else still listening? In a sense, Madeleine's disappearance has become a cultural symbol, a reminder of the fragility of life and the unanswered questions that persist. It's a legacy of both loss and the unrelenting quest for answers that transcends the McCanns' personal grief. Ultimately, the answer to the question, who remembers Madeleine, is not found in the headlines. It is found in the hearts of those who continue to search for her, who refuse to let her be forgotten, who still hold on to the belief that the truth can be uncovered, no matter how long it takes. Until then, all we have is silence